On a cold February morning in 1963, in a London flat where the gas meter had run out of coins, a young American poet sealed the kitchen door with towels, turned on the gas oven, and laid her head inside. Sylvia Plath was 30 years old, a mother of 2 small children, and on the verge of what many would later recognize as her greatest literary breakthrough. Her death would transform her from a promising but relatively unknown writer into one of the most influential and controversial figures in modern literature. A woman whose brief, brilliant life became inseparable from her art, whose personal anguish became universal poetry, and whose tragic end would overshadow and illuminate everything she had created. This is the story of how a gifted child from Massachusetts became the voice of a generation's pain, how genius and madness intertwined in ways that produced some of the most powerful poetry ever written, and how a life that seemed to promise everything ended in a kitchen in London, leaving behind a legacy that continues to inspire and haunt readers more than 60 years later. The story of Sylvia Plath begins on October 27, 1932, in the comfortable middle-class suburb of Jamaica Plain, Boston, where she was born into a family that embodied both the promise and the pressures of American academic achievement. Her father, Otto Emil Plath, was a German immigrant who had transformed himself from a working-class background into a respected professor of biology and entomology at Boston University. A man whose intellectual rigor and demanding perfectionism would cast a long shadow over his daughter's life even after his early death. Her mother, Aurelia Frances Schober Plath, was the American-born daughter of Austrian immigrants, a woman of considerable intelligence and ambition who had been Otto's student before becoming his wife, and who would dedicate her life to nurturing and promoting her daughter's extraordinary talents. The household into which Sylvia was born was one of high expectations and intellectual stimulation, where academic achievement was not merely encouraged but demanded, and where the life of the mind was considered the highest form of human endeavor. Otto Plath was a formidable figure, tall, stern, and utterly devoted to his scientific work, who brought to his family life the same methodical precision that characterized his research into the behavior of bumblebees. His study was filled with specimens, scientific journals, and the tools of his trade, creating an atmosphere of scholarly seriousness that permeated the entire household. Aurelia Plath, 21 years younger than her husband, was a woman caught between her own intellectual ambitions and the domestic expectations of her era. She had been a promising graduate student in English and German literature when she met Otto, and their courtship had been conducted largely through discussions of literature and ideas. After their marriage in 1932, she had subordinated her own academic career to support her husband's work while raising their children, but she never abandoned her love of literature or her belief in the transformative power of education. The early years of Sylvia's childhood were marked by the kind of intensive intellectual cultivation that was both a privilege and a burden. She was reading by the age of 4, writing stories and poems by 6, and demonstrating the kind of precocious verbal facility that marked her as exceptional from an early age. Her parents, recognizing her gifts, provided her with every opportunity to develop her talents, enrolling her in special programs, encouraging her writing, and creating an environment where intellectual achievement was the primary measure of worth. The family's life was centered around Otto's work and the rhythms of academic life, with summers spent at the family's cottage in Winthrop, Massachusetts, where Sylvia developed her lifelong love of the ocean and the natural world that would later feature so prominently in her poetry. These early summers by the sea were among the happiest times of her childhood, providing a respite from the intense academic atmosphere of the family home and allowing her to experience the kind of freedom and spontaneity that would become increasingly rare as she grew older. The idyllic nature of Sylvia's early childhood was shattered in 1940, when Otto Plath died suddenly at the age of 55 from complications related to diabetes that he had refused to treat properly, partly out of stubbornness and partly out of a fatalistic belief that medical intervention was futile. His death was traumatic, not only because of the loss itself, but because of the circumstances surrounding it. The long illness that he had hidden from his family, the financial difficulties that followed, and the sudden transformation of their comfortable middle-class existence into one of uncertainty and struggle. For 8-year-old Sylvia, her father's death was a catastrophe that would shape the rest of her life in ways that she would spend decades trying to understand and articulate. Otto had been not only her father, but her first and most important audience, the person whose approval she had sought above all others, and whose intellectual standards had become the measure by which she judged herself. His sudden absence left a void that would never be filled, creating a sense of abandonment and loss that would fuel both her creative ambition and her psychological struggles. The immediate aftermath of Otto's death brought dramatic changes to the family's circumstances, as Aurelia was forced to find work to support herself and her 2 children. She took a position teaching medical secretarial skills at Boston University, a job that provided financial stability but required her to work long hours and left her with little time for the kind of intensive attention she had previously devoted to Sylvia's education. The family moved from their comfortable home in Jamaica Plain to a smaller house in Wellesley, a change that represented not only a decline in their economic status, but also a fundamental shift in the family dynamics. Aurelia's response to her husband's death and the family's changed circumstances was to throw herself even more intensively into promoting Sylvia's talents and achievements, as if her daughter's success could somehow compensate for the losses they had suffered. She became Sylvia's manager, editor, and most devoted supporter, carefully preserving every piece of writing, documenting every achievement, and creating a detailed record of her daughter's development that would later prove invaluable to biographers and scholars. This intense focus on Sylvia's achievements, while well-intentioned, created enormous pressure on a child who was already naturally perfectionist and competitive. Sylvia learned early that love and approval were contingent on performance, that her worth as a person was measured by her accomplishments, and that failure was not merely disappointing but potentially catastrophic. These lessons, internalized at a young age, would shape her approach to everything she did for the rest of her life. The move to Wellesley brought new opportunities as well as new pressures, as Sylvia enrolled in the town's excellent public schools and began to establish herself as an exceptional student. She excelled in all her subjects but showed particular talent in English and creative writing, winning prizes and recognition that confirmed her family's belief in her special destiny. Her teachers recognized her gifts and provided encouragement and opportunities that helped to develop her skills, but they also contributed to the growing sense that she was different from her peers, marked for a special fate that set her apart from ordinary concerns and relationships. The adolescent years in Wellesley were marked by a complex mixture of achievement and anxiety, as Sylvia struggled to maintain the perfect image that had become central to her identity while dealing with the normal challenges of growing up. She was popular with her classmates, successful in her studies, and increasingly recognized as a talented writer, but beneath the surface, she was developing the patterns of thinking and feeling that would later contribute to her mental health struggles. The pressure to excel was constant and unrelenting, coming not only from her mother's expectations, but from her own internalized standards of perfection. Every grade, every competition, every social interaction became a test of her worth, and the fear of failure became a driving force that pushed her to ever greater achievements while also creating a constant undercurrent of anxiety and self-doubt. During these years, Sylvia also began to develop the complex relationship with her father's memory that would become one of the central themes of her poetry. Otto Plath became a mythical figure in her imagination, simultaneously idealized and resented, loved and hated, present and absent. She began to see his death not as a natural tragedy but as a deliberate abandonment, a betrayal that had left her and her family to struggle alone. This sense of abandonment would become intertwined with her feelings about men, authority, and her own identity in ways that would profoundly influence her later relationships and her artistic development. The high school years also saw the beginning of Sylvia's serious engagement with poetry and creative writing as she began to develop the distinctive voice and style that would later make her famous. She read voraciously, studying the work of poets like Emily Dickinson, Dylan Thomas, and W.H. Auden, and began to experiment with different forms and techniques. Her early poems showed remarkable technical skill and emotional intensity, demonstrating a precocious understanding of the power of language to capture and transform experience. By the time she graduated from high school in 1950, Sylvia Plath had established herself as one of the most promising young writers of her generation, with a record of achievement that seemed to guarantee future success. She had won numerous awards and competitions, published stories and poems in national magazines, and earned a scholarship to Smith College, one of the most prestigious women's colleges in the country. Yet beneath the surface of this remarkable success lay the seeds of the struggles that would define the rest of her life. The perfectionism that would never allow her to be satisfied with her achievements, the sense of abandonment that would make intimate relationships difficult, and the growing awareness that the golden cage of expectations and achievements that had defined her childhood was also a prison from which escape might prove impossible. The young woman who left Wellesley for Smith College in the fall of 1950 carried with her not only extraordinary talents and ambitions, but also the psychological burdens that would shape her destiny. She had learned to excel, to perform, to meet and exceed expectations. But she had also learned that love was conditional, that worth was measured by achievement, and that failure was not merely disappointing but potentially catastrophic. These lessons, learned in the comfortable suburbs of Boston, would follow her to college and beyond, shaping her relationships, her art, and ultimately her fate. The arrival of Sylvia Plath at Smith College in September 1950 marked the beginning of what should have been the most fulfilling period of her young life, as she entered an institution that seemed perfectly designed to nurture her extraordinary talents and ambitions. Smith College, nestled in the picturesque town of Northampton, Massachusetts, was one of the most prestigious women's colleges in America, a place where intellectual achievement was celebrated and where young women were encouraged to pursue their dreams without the limitations that society typically imposed on their sex. For Sylvia, who had spent her entire life preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity, Smith represented the chance to finally find her place among peers who shared her love of literature and learning. The campus itself was everything that Sylvia had dreamed of: ivy-covered buildings, tree-lined paths, and an atmosphere of scholarly seriousness that reminded her of the academic environment she had known in her father's study. Her dormitory room became a sanctuary where she could surround herself with books, papers, and the tools of her craft, creating the kind of intellectual space that she had always craved. The other students were bright, ambitious young women from similar backgrounds, and for the first time in her life, Sylvia found herself in an environment where her intensity and dedication were not unusual, but were instead the norm. The academic program at Smith was rigorous and demanding, exactly the kind of challenge that Sylvia thrived on. She threw herself into her studies with characteristic intensity, taking courses in English literature, creative writing, and foreign languages, while maintaining the kind of perfect academic record that had become her trademark. Her professors quickly recognized her exceptional abilities and began to provide her with the kind of individual attention and encouragement that helped to develop her skills while also feeding her need for recognition and approval. The creative writing program at Smith was particularly important to Sylvia's development, as it provided her with her first real community of fellow writers and with teachers who understood and appreciated her artistic ambitions. She studied under professors who were themselves accomplished writers and who could provide the kind of sophisticated feedback and guidance that she needed to develop her craft. The workshops and seminars became laboratories where she could experiment with different styles and techniques while receiving the kind of critical attention that helped her to refine her voice and vision. During her freshman year, Sylvia established herself as one of the most promising writers in her class. winning competitions and publishing her work in the college literary magazine. Her poems and stories demonstrated a remarkable maturity and technical skill that set her apart from her peers, while her academic work showed the kind of analytical intelligence that impressed her professors and earned her consistently high grades. She seemed to be fulfilling all the promise that had been evident since her childhood, and her letters home to her mother were filled with excitement about her classes, her writing, and her future prospects. Yet even during these early months at Smith, there were signs of the pressures and anxieties that would later contribute to her mental health crisis. The perfectionism that had driven her to excel throughout her childhood became even more intense in the competitive environment of college, where she was surrounded by other exceptional students who challenged her sense of being uniquely gifted. She began to experience the kind of self-doubt and anxiety that would become increasingly problematic as she progressed through college, worrying constantly about her performance and becoming devastated by any criticism or setback. The social aspects of college life proved to be more challenging for Sylvia than the academic work, as she struggled to balance her intense focus on her studies and writing with the expectations of dormitory life and social activities. She was popular with her classmates and participated in various campus organizations, but she often felt like she was performing a role rather than being herself, maintaining a cheerful and confident exterior while privately struggling with feelings of inadequacy and isolation. The pressure to excel was constant and unrelenting, coming not only from her own internalized standards, but from the expectations of her professors, her mother, and the broader community that had invested so much in her success. Every assignment, every grade, every competition became a test of her worth, and the fear of failure became an increasingly dominant force in her life. She began to develop the kind of rigid thinking patterns that would later contribute to her depression, seeing everything in terms of success or failure, perfection or catastrophe. The summer of 1953, between her junior and senior years, brought what seemed like the ultimate validation of Sylvia's talents and ambitions when she was selected as a guest editor for Mademoiselle magazine's annual college issue. The position was highly competitive and prestigious, offering the opportunity to spend a month in New York City working alongside professional editors and writers while gaining valuable experience in the publishing world. For Sylvia, who had dreamed of a career in writing and publishing, the opportunity seemed like a dream come true. The month in New York was both exhilarating and exhausting, as Sylvia threw herself into the work with characteristic intensity while also trying to take advantage of all the cultural and social opportunities that the city offered. She attended parties, met famous writers and editors, and experienced the kind of sophisticated urban life that she had only read about in books and magazines. Yet beneath the excitement and glamour, she was struggling with increasing anxiety and depression, feeling overwhelmed by the pace and pressure of the experience, while also beginning to question whether she really belonged in this world of professional writers and editors. The return to Wellesley at the end of the summer marked the beginning of the most serious crisis of Sylvia's young life, as the combination of exhaustion, disappointment, and mounting pressure finally overwhelmed her psychological defenses. She had expected to feel triumphant and validated by her success in New York, but instead she found herself feeling empty and directionless, unable to recapture the sense of purpose and excitement that had previously driven her. The future that had once seemed so clear and promising now appeared uncertain and frightening, and she began to experience the kind of severe depression that would plague her for the rest of her life. The symptoms of her depression were both psychological and physical, as she found herself unable to sleep, eat, or concentrate on her work. The activities that had once brought her joy and satisfaction, reading, writing, studying, became impossible burdens that she could no longer manage. She felt disconnected from her friends and family, unable to explain what was happening to her or to ask for the help that she desperately needed. The perfectionist facade that she had maintained for so long began to crumble, revealing the depth of her pain and confusion. The crisis came to a head in August 1953, when Sylvia made her first serious suicide attempt by taking an overdose of sleeping pills and hiding in the crawlspace beneath her family's house. The attempt was nearly successful, and she was found only after a massive search effort that involved police, neighbors, and volunteers from the community. The discovery of her unconscious body in the basement was traumatic not only for Sylvia but for her entire family, shattering the image of success and happiness that they had worked so hard to maintain. The hospitalization that followed was a turning point in Sylvia's life, as she was forced to confront the reality of her mental illness and to begin the long process of recovery and healing. She was initially treated at Massachusetts General Hospital and later transferred to McLean Hospital, a prestigious psychiatric facility where she received intensive treatment, including electroconvulsive therapy, psychotherapy, and medication. The experience was both terrifying and transformative, as she was forced to examine the patterns of thinking and feeling that had contributed to her crisis, while also learning new ways of coping with the pressures and expectations that had overwhelmed her. The treatment at McLean was conducted under the supervision of Dr. Ruth Boucher, a psychiatrist who would become one of the most important figures in Sylvia's life. Dr. Boucher was a skilled and compassionate therapist who understood the complex relationship between creativity and mental illness, and who helped Sylvia to begin the process of understanding her depression while also supporting her desire to continue her artistic development. The therapy sessions became a safe space where Sylvia could explore her feelings about her father's death, her relationship with her mother, and the pressures that had contributed to her breakdown. The months of treatment were difficult and painful, as Sylvia was forced to confront aspects of herself and her family that she had previously avoided or denied. She had to acknowledge that her perfectionism was not a strength but a vulnerability, that her need for approval and recognition was rooted in deep insecurities, and that the image of success and happiness that she had maintained was largely a facade. Yet the process was also liberating, as she began to develop a more realistic and compassionate understanding of herself while also learning new ways of managing her emotions and expectations. The return to Smith College in February 1954 was both triumphant and terrifying, as Sylvia faced the challenge of resuming her academic career while managing her ongoing mental health issues. She was determined to prove that her breakdown had been a temporary setback rather than a permanent disability, and she threw herself back into her studies and writing with renewed intensity. Her professors and classmates were supportive and understanding, and she was able to complete her degree requirements while also continuing to develop her artistic skills. The final year and a half at Smith was marked by some of Sylvia's most important early achievements as a writer, as she produced poems and stories that showed a new depth and maturity that reflected her experiences with mental illness and recovery. Her work began to explore themes of death, rebirth, and psychological transformation that would become central to her later poetry, while also demonstrating a technical sophistication that impressed her teachers and peers. She graduated summa cum laude in 1955, with a thesis on the double in Dostoevsky's novels that demonstrated her growing interest in the psychological complexities that would later inform her own work. The graduation from Smith represented both an ending and a beginning for Sylvia, as she prepared to leave the protective environment of college for the uncertainties of adult life. She had survived her first major mental health crisis and had proven to herself and others that she could overcome adversity while continuing to pursue her artistic ambitions. Yet she also carried with her the knowledge that her mental illness was likely to be a lifelong challenge, and that the pressures and expectations that had contributed to her breakdown would continue to be part of her life as she pursued her career as a writer. The young woman who left Smith College in June 1955 was fundamentally different from the confident freshman who had arrived 5 years earlier. She had experienced the depths of despair and had emerged with a deeper understanding of herself and her vulnerabilities, but also with a renewed commitment to her art and a determination to use her experiences as material for her writing. The crisis had been devastating, but it had also been transformative, providing her with the psychological insights and emotional depth that would later make her one of the most powerful and influential poets of her generation. The award of a Fulbright scholarship to study at Cambridge University represented the fulfillment of one of Sylvia Plath's most cherished dreams and marked the beginning of what would prove to be the most transformative period of her young life. The opportunity to study at one of the world's most prestigious universities, in the country that had produced many of her literary heroes, seemed like the perfect next step in her carefully planned journey toward literary greatness. Yet the move to England also represented a leap into the unknown, as she left behind the familiar world of American academia for the ancient traditions and different expectations of British university life. The journey to England in the autumn of 1955 was both exciting and daunting for Sylvia, who had never travelled so far from home or lived independently in a foreign country. The ocean crossing gave her time to reflect on the dramatic changes in her life since her breakdown 2 years earlier, and to prepare herself mentally for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. She arrived in Cambridge filled with determination to make the most of this extraordinary opportunity, while also proving to herself and others that she had fully recovered from her mental health crisis. Newnham College, where Sylvia was enrolled as a graduate student in English literature, was one of Cambridge's 2 women's colleges, an institution with a proud tradition of academic excellence and a commitment to providing women with the same rigorous education that had previously been available only to men. The college's red brick Victorian buildings and carefully tended gardens provided a beautiful and inspiring setting for study, while the library and common rooms offered spaces where serious intellectual work could flourish alongside the kind of stimulating conversation that Sylvia had always craved. The academic program at Cambridge was both more demanding and more flexible than what Sylvia had experienced at Smith, requiring her to work independently while also participating in the tutorial system that was central to British higher education. Her supervisor was a distinguished scholar who challenged her to think more deeply and critically about literature while also encouraging her to develop her own scholarly voice. The reading lists were extensive and challenging, requiring her to engage with texts and ideas that pushed her intellectual boundaries while also providing new material for her creative work. The social and cultural life of Cambridge was equally important to Sylvia's development during these years, as she found herself part of a community of brilliant and ambitious young people from around the world who shared her passion for literature and ideas. The university's ancient traditions and ceremonies provided a sense of continuity with the past that she found both inspiring and intimidating, while the informal gatherings in pubs and coffee shops offered opportunities for the kind of intellectual conversation that she had always enjoyed. Yet despite the many advantages and opportunities that Cambridge offered, Sylvia's first year was marked by periods of loneliness and self-doubt that reminded her of the vulnerabilities that lay beneath her confident exterior. The British academic system was different from what she was used to, and she sometimes felt like an outsider trying to understand unspoken rules and expectations. The weather was often grey and depressing, and she missed the familiar comforts of home while also struggling to establish new friendships and relationships. The turning point in Sylvia's Cambridge experience came in February 1956, when she attended a party for the literary magazine St. Botolph's Review and met Ted Hughes, a young English poet whose work and personality would transform her life in ways that she could never have anticipated. Hughes was tall, dark, and powerfully built, with an intensity and charisma that immediately attracted Sylvia's attention. He was also a serious poet, whose work showed a raw power and connection to nature that was unlike anything she had encountered before. The meeting between Sylvia and Ted has become one of the most famous encounters in literary history, partly because of Sylvia's own vivid account of the evening in her journals and letters. She was immediately struck by Ted's physical presence and intellectual intensity, while he was equally impressed by her beauty, intelligence, and obvious talent. Their conversation was passionate and wide-ranging, covering poetry, literature, and their shared ambitions as writers. And by the end of the evening, it was clear that something significant had begun between them. The relationship that developed between Sylvia and Ted over the following months was intense and all-consuming, combining physical passion with intellectual compatibility in ways that seemed to fulfill both of their deepest needs and desires. They shared a love of poetry and literature that went beyond mere academic interest to encompass a genuine belief in the transformative power of art, while their different backgrounds and perspectives provided each with new ways of seeing and understanding the world. Ted's influence on Sylvia's poetry was immediate and profound, as his example encouraged her to write with greater boldness and emotional directness, while also introducing her to new ways of thinking about the relationship between poetry and the natural world. His own work was deeply rooted in the English countryside, and in a kind of primitive mythology that was very different from the more intellectual and urban poetry that Sylvia had previously admired. And his example helped her to discover new sources of inspiration and new ways of expressing her own experiences and emotions. The courtship between Sylvia and Ted was conducted against the backdrop of their shared literary ambitions and their mutual recognition that they were both destined for greatness as writers. They read each other's work with the kind of serious attention that each had always craved, providing criticism and encouragement that helped both of them to develop their skills while also deepening their emotional connection. Their letters and journals from this period reveal the intensity of their intellectual and emotional engagement as they explored ideas about poetry, life, and their future together. The decision to marry came quickly, perhaps too quickly for such a momentous choice, but it seemed inevitable given the intensity of their connection and their shared vision of a life devoted to literature. The wedding took place on June 16, 1956, in a simple ceremony at St. George the Martyr Church in London, with only a few friends present as witnesses. The bride and groom were both 23 years old, both ambitious poets at the beginning of their careers, and both convinced that their union would enhance rather than compromise their individual artistic development. The early months of marriage were marked by a kind of euphoric productivity, as both Sylvia and Ted threw themselves into their writing with renewed energy and inspiration. They established routines that allowed each of them to work independently while also sharing ideas and providing mutual support and encouragement. Sylvia's poetry during this period showed new confidence and emotional depth, while Ted's work continued to develop the distinctive voice that would later make him one of England's most celebrated poets. The completion of Sylvia's degree at Cambridge in 1957 marked the end of one phase of her life and the beginning of another, as she and Ted prepared to return to America so that she could begin her career as a teacher while he worked on establishing himself as a poet. The 2 years at Cambridge had been transformative for Sylvia in ways that went far beyond her academic achievements, as she had found not only a husband and intellectual companion, but also a new sense of herself as a poet and as a woman capable of sustaining an intimate relationship despite her psychological vulnerabilities. The young couple who left England in the summer of 1957 carried with them not only their individual talents and ambitions, but also a shared vision of what their life together might become. They had found in each other the kind of intellectual and emotional partnership that each had always sought, and they were convinced that their marriage would provide the foundation for artistic achievements that neither could accomplish alone. The future seemed full of promise and possibility, and they approached it with the confidence and optimism of young people who believed that talent, hard work, and mutual devotion could overcome any obstacle. Yet even during these happy and productive months, there were signs of the tensions and conflicts that would later threaten their relationship and contribute to the tragic end of Sylvia's life. The intensity that made their connection so powerful also made it potentially destructive, as both partners brought to the marriage their own psychological vulnerabilities and artistic ambitions that might not always be compatible. The question of how two serious poets could sustain both their individual careers and their relationship would prove to be one of the central challenges of their life together, and one that would ultimately prove impossible to resolve. The return to America in the summer of 1957 marked the beginning of what Sylvia and Ted Hughes hoped would be the establishment of their life together as a literary couple, combining their individual artistic ambitions with the practical necessities of earning a living and building a home. Sylvia had accepted a position teaching freshman English at Smith College, her alma mater, a job that seemed to offer the perfect combination of intellectual stimulation, financial security, and the kind of prestigious academic affiliation that would enhance her reputation as a serious writer. For Ted, the move to America represented an opportunity to establish himself in a new literary market while also supporting his wife's career during this crucial early phase of their marriage. The return to Smith College as a faculty member was both thrilling and daunting for Sylvia, who found herself in the strange position of being back in the familiar environment where she had been a student just 2 years earlier, but now with the responsibilities and expectations of a professor. The campus looked the same, and many of her former teachers were still there, but her perspective had been fundamentally altered by her experiences at Cambridge, her marriage, and her growing confidence as a poet. She was no longer the anxious, perfectionist student seeking approval from her professors, but a young professional with her own ideas about literature and teaching. The teaching position at Smith was demanding and time-consuming, requiring Sylvia to prepare lectures, grade papers, and meet with students while also trying to maintain her own writing schedule. She approached the work with characteristic intensity and perfectionism, spending hours preparing for each class and agonizing over every assignment and grade. Her students found her to be an inspiring and demanding teacher who brought genuine passion to the study of literature, but the workload was exhausting and left little time for her own creative work. The challenge of balancing teaching responsibilities with writing became one of the central struggles of this period, as Sylvia discovered that the energy and attention required for effective teaching often left her too drained to work on her own poetry and fiction. She had always been able to excel at multiple tasks simultaneously, but the combination of a full-time teaching load, the responsibilities of marriage, and her own artistic ambitions proved to be more difficult to manage than she had anticipated. Ted's situation was equally challenging, as he struggled to establish himself as a poet in America while also dealing with the practical difficulties of being a foreign national seeking work in a competitive literary market. He had no teaching position and no regular income, which meant that the financial burden of supporting the household fell primarily on Sylvia's salary. This arrangement was practical and necessary, but it also created tensions and resentments that would become increasingly problematic as time went on. The couple established their first American home in a small apartment near the Smith campus, creating a domestic space that reflected their shared commitment to literature and their hopes for their future together. The apartment was filled with books, manuscripts, and the tools of their trade, while the walls were decorated with maps and photographs that reminded them of their time in England and their dreams of future travels. They established daily routines that allowed each of them time to write, with early morning hours reserved for poetry and evenings devoted to reading and discussion. Despite the challenges and pressures of this period, Sylvia's poetry continued to develop and mature, showing new confidence and technical sophistication that reflected her growing experience and emotional depth. She was beginning to find her distinctive voice as a poet, moving away from the more derivative work of her student years toward a style that was uniquely her own. The poems from this period show the influence of her marriage to Ted, her experiences as a teacher, and her ongoing struggle to balance her various roles and responsibilities. The social life of the young couple was centered around the academic community at Smith and the broader literary world of New England, where they met other writers and intellectuals who shared their interests and ambitions. These relationships provided important professional connections and friendships, but they also created additional pressures and expectations, as Sylvia and Ted were increasingly seen as a literary power couple whose success was measured not only by their individual achievements, but by their ability to maintain their partnership while pursuing their careers. The strain of trying to excel in all areas of her life began to take its toll on Sylvia's mental health, as she found herself experiencing the same kinds of anxiety and perfectionist pressures that had contributed to her breakdown during college. The teaching load was heavier than she had expected, and the constant pressure to perform at the highest level in both her professional and personal life was exhausting. She began to experience periods of depression and self-doubt that reminded her of her earlier struggles, though she was determined not to let these feelings interfere with her work or her marriage. The decision to leave Smith College after just 1 year of teaching was difficult but necessary, as Sylvia recognized that the demands of full-time teaching were incompatible with her goals as a writer. She and Ted decided to move to Boston, where they hoped to support themselves through freelance writing, part-time teaching, and other literary work while devoting more time to their own creative projects. The move represented a significant financial risk, but it also offered the possibility of the kind of life they had always envisioned for themselves. The Boston years, from 1958 to 1959, were marked by both creative productivity and financial uncertainty, as the young couple struggled to establish themselves as professional writers while also maintaining their relationship and their individual artistic development. They rented a small apartment on Beacon Hill, in the heart of Boston's literary district, and threw themselves into the work of building their careers through a combination of writing, teaching, and networking within the literary community. Sylvia's writing during this period showed continued growth and development, as she began to explore new themes and techniques while also working on her first novel, which would eventually become The Bell Jar. The novel was a semi-autobiographical work that drew heavily on her experiences with mental illness and recovery, and writing it required her to revisit some of the most painful periods of her life while also transforming them into art. The process was both therapeutic and challenging, as she struggled to find the right balance between honesty and artistic distance. Ted's career was also developing during this period, as he began to gain recognition for his poetry and to establish the professional relationships that would later prove crucial to his success. His first book of poems was accepted for publication, marking an important milestone in his career and providing validation for the decision to pursue writing as a full-time profession. The success was encouraging for both partners, as it suggested that their shared vision of a life devoted to literature was not merely a romantic dream, but a practical possibility. Yet the financial pressures and uncertainties of freelance writing were constant sources of stress, as the couple struggled to pay their bills, while also maintaining the kind of lifestyle that they felt was appropriate for serious writers. They took on various part-time jobs and writing assignments to supplement their income, but the work was often tedious and time-consuming, leaving less time and energy for their own creative projects. The social and cultural life of Boston provided important stimulation and connections, as Sylvia and Ted became part of a community of writers, artists, and intellectuals who shared their interests and ambitions. They attended readings, parties, and cultural events that exposed them to new ideas and influences, while also providing opportunities to meet editors, publishers, and other professionals who might help advance their careers. The period in Boston was also marked by important developments in Sylvia's understanding of herself as a woman and as a writer, as she began to grapple more seriously with questions about the relationship between her personal life and her artistic work. The example of other women writers, both contemporary and historical, provided models and inspiration, but also highlighted the particular challenges faced by women who sought to combine serious artistic careers with marriage and family life. By the end of 1959, Sylvia and Ted had decided that they needed a change of scene and a new set of challenges to continue their development as writers. The decision to return to England was motivated partly by practical considerations, Ted's greater familiarity with the British literary scene and the possibility of better opportunities there, but also by their shared sense that they needed to escape the pressures and expectations of American literary life in order to find their own authentic voices as artists. The 2 years in America had been important for both partners, providing them with valuable experience and helping them to establish their careers, while also testing their relationship and their commitment to their shared vision of a literary life. They had learned important lessons about the challenges of balancing artistic ambition with practical necessities, and about the difficulties of maintaining both individual identity and partnership in the competitive world of professional writing. As they prepared to return to England, they carried with them not only greater experience and confidence, but also a deeper understanding of the complexities and contradictions that would continue to shape their life together. The decision to return to England in late 1959 represented more than just a geographical move for Sylvia and Ted Hughes. It marked the beginning of what would prove to be the most creatively productive and personally fulfilling period of their marriage, as well as the prelude to the crisis that would ultimately destroy their relationship and lead to Sylvia's tragic death. The young couple who crossed the Atlantic in December 1959 carried with them not only their accumulated experience as writers and teachers, but also a renewed sense of purpose and possibility, convinced that England would provide the environment they needed to flourish both as artists and as a family. The initial months back in England were spent in London, where they rented a small flat and threw themselves into the work of re-establishing their place in the British literary scene. Ted's connections from his Cambridge years proved valuable in helping them to meet editors, publishers, and other writers who could provide both professional opportunities and personal friendships. Sylvia, meanwhile, worked to adapt her American experiences and perspectives to the different expectations and traditions of British literary culture, a process that would ultimately enrich her work while also creating new challenges and tensions. The London literary world of 1960 was vibrant and exciting, with new movements and voices emerging that would reshape British poetry and fiction for decades to come. Sylvia and Ted found themselves at the centre of this cultural renaissance, attending readings and parties where they met some of the most important writers of their generation, while also establishing their own reputations as serious and talented artists. The intellectual stimulation and professional opportunities were exactly what they had hoped for, but the social pressures and competitive atmosphere also created new sources of stress and anxiety. The most significant development of this period was Sylvia's pregnancy, which was announced in late 1959 and which would fundamentally alter the trajectory of both her life and her art. The prospect of motherhood was both thrilling and terrifying for Sylvia, who had always struggled to balance her various roles and responsibilities, and who now faced the challenge of adding parenthood to her already complex identity as wife, writer, and professional woman. The pregnancy also raised practical questions about how she and Ted would manage their careers while caring for a child, and whether their shared vision of a literary life was compatible with the demands of family life. The birth of Frida Rebecca Hughes on April 1, 1960, was a transformative experience for Sylvia, who discovered in motherhood both new sources of joy and creativity, and new depths of anxiety and responsibility. The baby was healthy and beautiful, and Sylvia threw herself into the role of mother with the same intensity and perfectionism that she brought to everything else in her life. She was determined to be the perfect mother while also continuing to develop her career as a writer, a goal that proved to be both inspiring and exhausting. The early months of motherhood were marked by the kind of sleep deprivation and physical exhaustion that are common to all new parents. But for Sylvia, these challenges were complicated by her perfectionist tendencies and her ongoing struggles with depression and anxiety. She found it difficult to accept that she could not excel at motherhood in the same way that she had excelled at her studies and her writing, and the normal difficulties of caring for an infant became sources of self-doubt and frustration that threatened to overwhelm her. Yet motherhood also provided Sylvia with new material and inspiration for her writing, as she began to explore themes of birth, growth, and the complex relationships between mothers and children that would become central to her later poetry. The experience of pregnancy and childbirth gave her access to aspects of female experience that she had not previously explored in her work, while the daily realities of caring for a child provided her with new insights into the nature of love, responsibility, and sacrifice. The decision to leave London for the countryside was motivated partly by practical considerations, the need for more space and a quieter environment for raising a child, but also by Ted's deep connection to the natural world and his belief that rural life would provide better conditions for both writing and family life. In September 1961, they purchased Court Green, a thatched cottage in the village of North Taunton in Devon, a property that would become both the setting for some of Sylvia's greatest poetry and the stage for the final act of her marriage. Court Green was everything that the young family had hoped for. A beautiful and historic house with extensive gardens, surrounded by the kind of English countryside that had always featured prominently in Ted's poetry. The house itself was spacious enough to provide separate studies for both writers, while the gardens offered opportunities for the kind of outdoor life that they both enjoyed. The village was small and quiet, providing the peace and privacy that they needed for their work while also offering a sense of community and belonging. The move to Devon marked the beginning of what would prove to be the most productive period of Sylvia's career as a poet, as the combination of rural life, motherhood, and domestic stability provided her with both the time and the inspiration she needed to develop her distinctive voice and vision. The poems written during this period show a new confidence and emotional depth as she began to explore themes of nature, domesticity, and female experience, with a boldness and originality that set her apart from her contemporaries. The daily routine at Court Green was carefully structured to accommodate both the demands of family life and the requirements of serious writing, with early morning hours reserved for poetry and afternoons devoted to childcare and domestic responsibilities. Sylvia approached this schedule with characteristic discipline and determination, rising before dawn to work on her poems while the house was quiet and peaceful. The isolation of rural life, which might have been lonely for some writers, proved to be exactly what she needed to focus on her work and to develop the kind of concentrated attention that her best poetry required. The birth of Nicholas Ferrar Hughes on January 17, 1962, brought new joy to the family, but also increased the pressures and responsibilities that Sylvia was already struggling to manage. The second pregnancy had been more difficult than the first, and the addition of another child to the household meant that her time and energy were even more divided between her roles as mother and writer. Yet she continued to work with remarkable productivity and focus, producing some of her finest poems during this period while also managing the complex logistics of caring for two small children. The poetry written during the Devon years shows Sylvia at the height of her powers, combining technical mastery with emotional intensity in ways that created a new kind of confessional poetry that was both deeply personal and universally resonant. Poems like Morning Song, The Moon and the Yew Tree, and Crossing the Water demonstrate her growing ability to transform the ordinary experiences of domestic life into profound meditations on love, loss, and the human condition. Yet even during this period of creative fulfillment and domestic happiness, there were signs of the tensions and conflicts that would eventually destroy the marriage and contribute to Sylvia's tragic end. The isolation of rural life, while beneficial for writing, also meant that both partners were more dependent on each other for intellectual stimulation and emotional support than they had been in London or Boston. The pressures of caring for two small children while also maintaining their careers created new sources of stress and conflict, while the financial uncertainties of freelance writing continued to be a constant worry. Ted's growing success as a poet, while gratifying for both partners, also created new dynamics in their relationship, as he began to receive the kind of recognition and opportunities that Sylvia had always craved for herself. His work was being published and praised, while hers remained largely unknown outside of literary magazines. a situation that created feelings of resentment and competition that neither partner was entirely comfortable acknowledging or discussing. The summer of 1962 brought the crisis that would shatter the apparent tranquility of their life at Court Green when Ted began an affair with Assia Wevel, a beautiful and sophisticated woman who was married to a Canadian poet. The affair was devastating for Sylvia, who had invested so much of her identity and her hopes for the future in her marriage, and who had always struggled with feelings of abandonment and betrayal that dated back to her father's death. The discovery of the affair in July 1962 marked the beginning of the end of the marriage, as Sylvia was forced to confront the reality that the partnership she had believed to be the foundation of her life was fundamentally flawed and possibly irreparable. The betrayal was particularly painful because it came at a time when she had finally seemed to achieve the kind of life she had always wanted: a successful marriage, beautiful children, a lovely home, and a developing career as a poet. The months that followed were marked by desperate attempts at reconciliation, alternating with bitter arguments and recriminations, as both partners struggled to understand what had gone wrong and whether their relationship could be salvaged. Sylvia's response to the crisis was characteristically intense and all-consuming, as she threw herself into her writing with renewed fury, while also trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life for the sake of their children. The poetry written during this period of crisis shows a new level of emotional intensity and artistic achievement, as Sylvia channeled her pain and anger into some of the most powerful and memorable poems of her career. Works like Daddy, Lady Lazarus, and Ariel demonstrate her ability to transform personal anguish into universal art, creating poems that speak to the experiences of betrayal, abandonment, and rage that are part of the human condition. The decision to separate was made in September 1962, when Ted moved out of Court Green to live with Assia in London, leaving Sylvia alone with the children in the Devon countryside. The separation was traumatic for everyone involved, but particularly for Sylvia, who found herself facing the prospect of single motherhood while also dealing with the emotional devastation of her marriage's collapse and the practical challenges of maintaining her career and her home without Ted's support. The decision to leave Devon for London in December 1962 represented Sylvia Plath's final attempt to rebuild her life and career in the aftermath of her marriage's collapse. But it also marked the beginning of the darkest and most desperate period of her existence. The move to the city was motivated by practical considerations: the need to be closer to publishers, editors, and other professional opportunities, but also by her hope that a change of environment might help her to escape the painful memories and associations that had made life at Court Green increasingly unbearable. The flat that Sylvia rented at 23 Fitzroy Road in Primrose Hill was both symbolically and practically significant, as it was located in the same building where W.B. Yeats had once lived, a connection that seemed to promise literary inspiration and success. The apartment was small but adequate for her needs, with enough space for herself and the two children while also providing a study where she could continue her writing. The location was convenient and fashionable, placing her at the heart of London's literary world while also providing access to the cultural and educational opportunities that she wanted for her children. Yet the move to London also brought new challenges and pressures that would prove to be overwhelming for someone already struggling with depression, financial uncertainty, and the trauma of marital breakdown. The winter of 1962 to 1963 was one of the coldest on record in England, with temperatures that made heating expensive and difficult, while also creating the kind of grey, oppressive atmosphere that had always been particularly hard for Sylvia to endure. The flat was poorly heated and often uncomfortable, while the noise and bustle of city life provided a stark contrast to the peace and quiet of the Devon countryside. The practical challenges of single motherhood in London were enormous, as Sylvia found herself responsible for all aspects of childcare while also trying to maintain her writing career and manage the complex logistics of urban life. The children, Frida and Nicholas, were still very young, 2 and 11 months respectively, and required constant attention and care that left little time or energy for other activities. The absence of the support network that she had enjoyed in Devon, where neighbours and friends had been available to help with childcare and domestic responsibilities, made every task more difficult and time-consuming. The financial pressures were equally daunting, as Sylvia struggled to support herself and the children on the modest income from her writing and the irregular support payments from Ted. The cost of living in London was significantly higher than in Devon, while the expenses associated with childcare, heating, and other necessities created a constant source of anxiety and stress. She was forced to take on freelance writing assignments and other work that provided immediate income, but left little time for the kind of serious poetry that she considered her true calling. Despite these overwhelming challenges, the final months of Sylvia's life were marked by an extraordinary burst of creative productivity that produced some of the most powerful and influential poems in the English language. Working in the early morning hours before the children woke, often in a freezing cold room with only a small heater for warmth, she wrote with an intensity and focus that seemed to draw on reserves of energy and inspiration that she had never before accessed. The poems from this period, including Daddy, Lady Lazarus, Ariel, Edge, and Words, represent the culmination of her artistic development and stand as monuments to her genius and her suffering. The poetry written during these final months shows a complete mastery of her craft, combined with an emotional intensity that is almost unbearable to read. The technical sophistication that she had developed over years of study and practice was now serving a vision that was both deeply personal and universally resonant, as she transformed her experiences of abandonment, betrayal, and despair into art that spoke to the fundamental conditions of human existence. The poems are characterized by their bold imagery, their musical language, and their unflinching examination of themes that most writers would have found too painful or too dangerous to explore. The famous poem Daddy, written in October 1962, exemplifies both the power and the controversy that would surround Sylvia's late work, as she used the Holocaust as a metaphor for her own psychological suffering, while also exploring her complex feelings about her father's death and its continuing impact on her life. The poem's shocking imagery and emotional intensity created a new kind of confessional poetry that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in literary discourse while also demonstrating the transformative power of art to give meaning to suffering. Lady Lazarus, written around the same time, presents an even more direct confrontation with themes of death and rebirth. As the speaker describes her suicide attempts as a kind of performance art, while also asserting her determination to survive and to transform her suffering into power. The poem's combination of vulnerability and defiance, of self-destruction and self-assertion, captures the contradictions that were central to Sylvia's personality and her art. The social isolation that characterized Sylvia's final months was both a choice and a necessity, as she found herself increasingly unable to maintain the kind of relationships and activities that had previously provided support and stimulation. The demands of caring for two small children while also dealing with her own psychological struggles left little time or energy for socializing, while her growing depression made it difficult to reach out to friends and colleagues who might have been able to help. The few people who did see Sylvia during this period were struck by the contrast between her public persona, still charming, intelligent, and apparently in control, and the private reality of her struggle with despair and exhaustion. She continued to present herself as a competent and successful writer and mother, but those who knew her well could see the signs of the crisis that was building beneath the surface. The Christmas season of 1962 was particularly difficult, as Sylvia found herself alone with the children while Ted spent the holidays with Assia. The contrast between the festive atmosphere of the city and her own isolation and despair was almost unbearable, while the financial pressures of providing gifts and special meals for the children created additional stress and anxiety. She managed to maintain some semblance of normal holiday celebrations for the sake of Frida and Nicholas, but the effort required enormous emotional and physical energy that she could barely spare. The new year brought little relief from the pressures and challenges that had made the previous month so difficult. As the cold weather continued and the practical problems of single motherhood in London remained as daunting as ever. Sylvia's depression was becoming more severe and more difficult to manage, while the isolation and exhaustion were taking an increasingly heavy toll on her physical and mental health. The final weeks of January and early February 1963 were marked by a series of small crises and setbacks that seemed to push Sylvia closer to the edge of despair. The children were frequently ill with the colds and flu that were common during the harsh winter, requiring additional care and attention that she was barely able to provide. The heating in the flat was inadequate and expensive, while the constant grey skies and bitter cold created the kind of oppressive atmosphere that had always been particularly difficult for her to endure. The literary world that had once seemed so welcoming and full of opportunity now appeared indifferent to her struggles, as editors and publishers failed to respond to her submissions with the enthusiasm and recognition that she had always craved. The contrast between her growing artistic achievement and her lack of public recognition was particularly painful, as she produced some of her finest work while receiving little acknowledgement or support from the literary establishment. The final poem that Sylvia wrote, Edge, was completed just days before her death and seems to anticipate the tragic end that was approaching. The poem presents a vision of a woman who has achieved a kind of perfection through death, suggesting that Sylvia had begun to see suicide not as a failure or a defeat, but as a form of artistic completion. The calm, almost serene tone of the poem contrasts sharply with the anguish and fury of her earlier work, suggesting that she had reached a state of resignation or acceptance that was perhaps even more dangerous than her previous despair. The events of February 11th, 1963 began like many other days during that terrible winter, with Sylvia rising early to work on her writing while the children slept. She had been suffering from a severe case of flu that had left her even more exhausted and depressed than usual, while the continuing cold weather and the practical pressures of daily life had created a sense of hopelessness that seemed impossible to overcome. The decision to end her life appears to have been made suddenly, perhaps in response to some final disappointment or setback that pushed her beyond her ability to cope. She carefully prepared for the children's safety, leaving bread and milk in their room and sealing the door to protect them from the gas before going to the kitchen and turning on the oven. The method she chose, placing her head in the gas oven, was one that had been used by other writers and artists, and it may have seemed to her like a literary as well as a practical choice. The discovery of Sylvia's body later that morning by a workman who had come to do repairs in the building marked the end of one of the most promising and troubled careers in modern literature. She was 30 years old, the mother of 2 small children, and at the height of her artistic powers, having produced in her final months some of the most powerful and influential poetry ever written. Her death was both a personal tragedy and a cultural loss, depriving the world of a voice that had only begun to reach its full potential. The immediate aftermath of Sylvia's suicide was marked by shock, grief, and a desperate search for explanations that might make sense of such a devastating loss. Friends and family struggled to understand how someone with so much talent and so much to live for could have reached such a point of despair, while the literary world began to grapple with the implications of losing such a promising young writer at the very moment when her work was reaching its greatest power and significance. The woman who died in London on that February morning in 1963 could never have imagined the extent to which her work would continue to influence and inspire readers around the world. Her poetry has become part of the permanent literature of the English language, while her story has become a powerful reminder of both the possibilities and the perils of the artistic life. In an age of increasing complexity and uncertainty, her voice remains as clear and compelling as ever, speaking to the fundamental experiences of human existence with a power and honesty that few writers have ever achieved.